We continue our survey of the history of the interpretation of the Tanakh by turning to the roots of historical criticism. In particular, we want to focus on those aspects that contribute to the rise of historical criticism as a methodology. So we begin with the first background element, the relationship between faith and reason. In the intellectual revolution that was fostered by the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Reformation, there is reflected an increasing tension between two sources of authority. On one hand, we have the teachings of the church and the authority of the fathers of the church. And this was both accepted and asserted to be the foundation for what all Christians should believe and teach. At the same time, there was an increasing conviction that humans have the ability to understand the cosmos on their own, on the basis of what they observe and on the basis of the operations and conclusions of human reason as they relate to what we observe. And this development ultimately leads to two different philosophical positions, rationalism and empiricism, and we're not going to go into details on those. They ultimately established competing claims, but regardless of which was correct or how they emerged together and were resolved ultimately in the work of Immanuel Kant, that aside, they reflect the idea, increasingly commonly held, that humans have the ability to understand the cosmos and to arrive at truth about the world in which they live on the basis of the operations of the senses and the results of human reason as they operated on those observations. So there is then an emerging change in the understanding, particularly among the educated classes, of the relationship between faith and reason. The historical position that undergirded Christian theology was articulated first by St. Augustine and then reiterated in the famous phrase of Anselm of Canterbury, credo ut intellegam, I believe in order that I might understand. In other words, that understanding is rooted in belief. But increasingly, as the Middle Ages developed and we worked through the events of the Renaissance and later the Reformation, there was an increasing conviction that belief should be founded on understanding or reason rather than that belief and faith should shape what reason holds. And so there is a struggle in these centuries to resolve the tension between the claims of faith and reason. And this tension and the need to resolve it kind of marks the emergence of what we think of as the modern world. But for our concerns here specifically, that increasing tension and the struggles to resolve it provides the context, specifically the intellectual context, for the rise of historical critical thought. We see this in the broader world in the work of the Islamic philosopher Averroes. Averroes had an important influence as the understanding of Aristotle and the implications of his philosophy began to spread through the intellectual community among Christians in Western Europe. Averroes is the short, Latinized version of the man's much longer name. He's typically known within Islam as Ibn Rushd, the end of his name, but in the Latin-speaking West, that becomes Averroes. He was, as I indicated, a philosopher. At least that's the way we primarily think of him today, although in his time he was a lawyer and a physician and also mathematician. But to us, he is best known or to Western Christianity at least, he became best known as a commentator upon Aristotle. And his commentaries on Aristotle attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophical thought with the theology and understanding that undergirded Islam. And this led Averroes to assert a position that was controversial within Islam and also became controversial within Western Europe, although there are many people today who would accept this position without second thought. Because Averroes argued for what we might call the theory of double truth. Namely, that within the realm of theology there are some things that are true, and within the realm of philosophy there are other things that are true, and these two might contradict one another, or at least appear to do so, but that shouldn't be a problem because each was true within its own realm or within its own domain. And so there was no difficulty in asserting conflicting truths as long as they were in different domains of knowledge. It's unclear to what extent Averroes understood his assertions in exactly that way, but that's the way they come to be characterized, and it's certainly the position that has developed from the position that Averroes himself took. As a secondary matter, he promoted what was known as monopsychism, the view that all humans shared one soul, which they participated. That's not so important for our concerns, although it was a matter on which he was deeply criticized at the time. Among Christian philosophers and thinkers, the positions of Averroes were most strongly advocated by a professor at the University of Paris, Siger of Brabant. Siger became the major proponent of Averroes, particularly of his view of the theory of two truths. And he taught at the University of Paris. This brought him into conflict with Thomas Aquinas, who believed that faith and reason could be reconciled, and indeed had been reconciled in his philosophical system. Again, not enough of Siger's own works survive today for us to be able to assess clearly the extent to which he promoted Averroes' theory of double truth. But he was certainly accused of having done so by people at the time, and some even accused him of promoting the monopsychism of Averroes. But again, that's simply less important for our purposes. In any case, after he was officially condemned in 1277, he was forced out of the University of Paris, eventually kind of wandering through southern Europe, arrived in Italy, and he was eventually murdered, at least according to tradition, by his secretary. But the struggle between Siger and Aquinas over how to understand the relationship between faith and reason reflects the increasing tension and also the view that Siger promotes, Averroes' theory of double truth, has become increasingly important in the modern world. So this struggle to resolve the tension becomes one of the foundation pieces of the modern world and provides the context, as we said, for the rise of historical criticism. If we were to jump ahead to the 20th century, we would see the results of this tension and how they work themselves out in the writings of the well-known critical philosopher Ernst Troeltsch. In 1898, Troeltsch wrote a book called On Historical and Dogmatic Method in Theology. And in this work, Troeltsch identifies three principles which he regards as foundational to the appropriate historical critical methodology. And Troeltsch did not actually originate these three. There were others who suggested all of them before his time, but he did bring them together and express them in a concise and effective way so that his explanation of them has been widely accepted as both correct and kind of representing the foundational views behind historical criticism. The first of these three principles we would probably call the principle of criticism. The principle of criticism is the affirmation of the idea of methodological doubt. Now, the idea of methodological doubt, or doubt as the starting point for intellectual inquiry, that was not new. We found it all the way back in Abelard. It was a prominent feature of the philosophy of René Descartes and others along the way. But what distinguishes Trelt from Abelard and even Descartes is that for the earlier thinkers, doubt was the starting point, but doubt should lead to certainty. But for Trelt and his understanding, doubt can never ultimately be resolved because historical study establishes probability, not certainty. And so one can never arrive at the point of certainty on a particular matter in the study of history and undergirding that in the study of theology, because we can never really be absolutely certain of the truth. And so doubt remains not as just simply as a starting point, but as the ending point also of the intellectual task. So doubt becomes a foundational methodological piece for historical criticism. The second of Trelt's principles is known as the principle of analogy. And here, the basic point is that the way things happen today in the world is the way they've always happened. In other words, our understanding of what happens in history has to be shaped by the processes and operations that we observe in the world today. So, present observable events must shape our understanding of non-observable events that we can't immediately perceive and watch in the past. The third of Trelt's principles is perhaps the most difficult for most people to get their minds around, but it's actually fairly straightforward. The principle of correlation. Trelt argues that history is an interconnected sequence of causes and events. That is, for everything that happens, there is a cause or a series of causes. The point is that nothing can interrupt those causes. We have to be able to articulate the causes and events that give rise to a particular moment or occurrence in history. And this, in effect, eliminates miracles from the historical process, because miracles, by their definition of divine direct intervention in the events of history, they fall outside of the realm of causes and events. God becomes a direct and immediate cause, and therefore God and the direct action of God in history has to be eliminated, and things must be explained purely on the basis of the natural sequence of causes and events as we observe them in the world today, going back to Trelt's second principle. And so these three principles articulated by Trelt reflect the intellectual struggle to establish the relationship between faith and reason that for the modern world is ultimately resolved on the side of reason, not of faith. A second element that is extremely important in the rise of historical criticism is the effect of the Reformation. Now, you will recall that all the major reformers promoted the study of the Bible and asserted that the individual believer had the ability to understand and interpret the Bible correctly. And this also became the foundation of the principle common in the Reformation that we today call sola scriptura, the idea that the teachings of the church must be based upon the Scripture alone. What is not immediately obvious to most people who study the Reformation is that this principle and these understandings on the part of the Reformers actually not only undermined the authority of the church as it relates to the church's ability to dictate what people believed, but it also undermined the authority of the church within the intellectual realm as well. So as this increasing tension between faith and reason begins to work its way out in the period after the Renaissance, the ability of the church to assert what is to be believed and held by Christians is diminishing as a result of the effects of the Reformation. And so the church, which had for 1,000 years defined what the orthodox interpretation of the Scriptures was to be, had lost the ability to dictate those things in a large part of Christendom. And that's why many historical critical scholars identify Martin Luther, reformers in general, but especially Martin Luther, as one of the foundational fathers, if you will, of historical criticism. That is, in many respects, patently unfair to Luther, who would have not held to any of the major conclusions to which historical criticism eventually led. And the reason that it's unfair is that the Reformers' principle of sola scriptura did not by itself lead to historical criticism. It only did so when it was joined with the rationalism of the Renaissance. So when you get the rationalism of the Renaissance and the diminished authority of the church that was promoted by the Reformers coming together, there you have the open door that made it possible to question the integrity and authority of the Bible itself. So it's not accidental that historical criticism arose and flourished in those countries where the Reformation had been most successful. And in those countries where the Reformation had been less successful, like Spain and Italy, the historical critical movement struggled to gain a foothold. So in France, to a lesser extent France, but particularly in England and in the Low Countries where the Reformation had been more successful, and in Germany, of course, their historical criticism found its roots and was able to develop. And so in that way, the Reformation also contributed in a major way to the rise of historical criticism. Let's turn now to some of the early thinkers who provided foundational pieces for the rise of historical criticism. There are a number that we could talk about, but let's focus simply on those who are most important. And for that, we'll begin with Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes, an English philosopher and writer, concluded, as it relates to the Bible, that the content of the books of the Bible, not the tradition of interpretation, has to guide our understanding of the origin and the meaning of biblical books. And so Hobbes reads a passage like this one in Genesis chapter 12. Abraham passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, there were Canaanites in the land. And on the basis of this, Hobbes concludes that this and other similar verses must have been written at a time when the Canaanites were no longer in the land, and thus they constituted evidence of later authorship. And so on the basis of this evidence that he saw of later authorship, Hobbes concludes that Moses wrote the sections of the Pentateuch that are directly attributed to him, but that he didn't write the rest of it, and that he certainly did not produce the final form of the Pentateuch as we have it now. So Hobbes didn't argue that Moses wrote nothing, but rather that he was simply, his contributions were more limited, and that he was certainly not responsible for the final form of the Pentateuch. Another early thinker who laid a foundational piece for the rise of historical criticism was the Jewish, later Christian philosopher Baruch, known today mostly by the Latinized form Benedict Spinoza. Spinoza was expelled from the Jewish community and eventually found a home within Christianity. But his study of the scriptures from his perspective led him to the conclusion that the scripture speaks inaccurately about God and events. And the reason for this is that it wasn't attempting to tell historical truth. He says that its object is not to convince the reason, but to attract and lay hold of the imagination. And so because the purpose or function of the scriptures was to, we would say today, create faith, to stimulate belief, as it did that, it was successful. But because it wasn't trying to tell the historical truth, therefore it does not speak accurately about God and about historical events. This is the foundation of the view that we would today call something like functional inerrancy. That is to say, there are those who claim to believe that the Bible is inerrant, that it doesn't err, but their understanding of that is that it doesn't err in what it is attempting to do, that is to create faith. And so this view of Spinoza's is articulated today in circles that want to find some reason to hold on to the Bible as a matter of religious truth while rejecting its claims of historicity. But for Spinoza himself, he asserted that the Bible was imperfect, corrupt, erroneous, and inconsistent in its own views. And of course, this not very high view of the Bible certainly affected his understanding of Christianity as well. The next person who leads developments more directly toward the rise of historical criticism as a literary methodology is the French author Richard Simon. Simon, in 1678, writes a work that is known as the Critical History of the Old Testament. And ironically, Simon was attempting to undermine the Protestant use of the Bible as the basis of faith. And so his attempt to undermine Protestant dependence upon the Bible as the basis of doctrine leads him to a view that was not only unacceptable to Protestants, but ultimately unacceptable even to the Catholic authorities within his own church. He argues that careful study of the literary and stylistic features of the Pentateuch in particular would lead us to the observation that there are often doublets or passages or places where things are said more than once. Simon concludes that the existence of these doublets demonstrates that there were multiple authors or multiple sources that underlie the text as we have it today, so that the text that we have it today is a combination of the views of various authors or the positions held in various sources that were combined to create the text as we have it. Now, Simon does this on the basis of an assumption that is unstated by him, but continues to be held as a foundational assumption of historical criticism, not always widely recognized, but always of foundational importance in criticism. This unstated assumption is that all authors write consistently. That is to say, when they write, they express kind of a single idea in a consistent way with a regular, dependable, and consistent set of vocabulary and phraseology. So this notion that writers always in effect, assert the same thing in the same language all the time, that they're consistent in what they do, becomes a foundational presupposition on which virtually the entire edifice of later historical criticism is built. And the reason for that is that the corollary to this assumption is that any inconsistency is, by definition, diversity of authorship. So anytime you have a doublet, unless it's simply repeated the same word for word, there will be inconsistencies and differences between those two accounts. And therefore, by definition, the very existence of doublets becomes evidence for diversity of authorship. Now, ironically, traditionalists and conservatives attempted to respond to this by pointing to the common things that texts have in common. So, for example, if the issue is the authorship of Isaiah, of the difference between, say, Isaiah chapter 1 to 39 and then the later chapters of the book, the stylistic and thematic differences, leads critical scholars to believe that there are multiple authors involved in the later book of Isaiah, or what becomes the book of Isaiah. Conservatives have tended to respond to that by pointing out the many things that the first part of the book and the later parts of the book have in common. However, here's a case of historical criticism wanting to have its cake and eat it too, because in the minds of historical critics, consistency is never evidence of the unity of authorship, because consistency could theoretically have been imposed by a later editor. So editors become the way of explaining away elements that would point to the unity of authorship, while highlighting the small differences that they see as evidence for diverse authorship. And so in that way, Richard Simon's study becomes a foundational principle of modern historical criticism, so that after Simon, it became commonplace to identify multiple sources within the Pentateuch on the basis of stylistic and literary and vocabulary kinds of differences that one encounters in the text. These are just a few of the early critical thinkers who become important for establishing the methodology that we know today as historical criticism. There's another factor that was at work, particularly in the spread of historical criticism, and that's the influence of deism. Deism is not directly related to historical criticism, but it is an outcome of that development of the tension between faith and reason that resolves that tension in favor of reason. And so deism resolves the tension between faith and reason by making faith subordinate to reason, in effect, doing away with faith as an element in belief entirely. And so deism calls for a religion that is based entirely upon reason. Now, the effects of this for biblical interpretation are simple, because a religion based entirely on reason has no place for divine revelation. And so deism rejects any notion that the Bible is inspired or that God has a role in revealing religious truth to mankind. So we see the effects of this on a broader scale in the works of an American author, Thomas Paine, a leading deistic writer here in America at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. Paine was not a biblical scholar per se, and I mention him only because he reflects the mood of the day, if you will, and how it has developed, not because Paine himself has any direct influence on the rise of historical criticism. But Paine writes, for example, that in deism our reason and belief are happily united. That is to say, if since belief is subservient to reason, there is no tension or conflict there. Payne is highly critical of traditional Christian teaching and describes the Christian religion as a parody upon ancient sun worship, in which Christians put a man called Christ in place of the sun and pay him the adoration originally paid to the sun. I think not just any any conservative Christian, but any intellectually honest historian would know that that's simply not true. But in any case, Payne emphasizes how different deism is from traditional Christianity. And he says that the true deist has only one deity, and his religion consists of contemplating the power and wisdom and goodness of that deity as revealed through his works, that is, creation, and to imitate him in everything moral, scientific, and mechanical. So obviously, in a view such as this, that's based entirely on reason and rejects the biblical witness, the Bible as a faithful witness to what God has done within history becomes largely irrelevant. So deism is a product of these processes, but it also contributes to the spread of historical criticism, particularly in England and in America. It resolves the tension between faith and reason by making faith subordinate to reason. It establishes or claims to be a religion based entirely upon reason and therefore rejects any notion of the divine inspiration of the Bible. And deism is an important contributing factor to the widespread adoption of critical thought, particularly in England and in America, and to a lesser degree in France, not so much in Germany at all. So that's a quick look at the influence of deism on the spread of historical criticism. And that brings us to an end of our quick survey of the roots of historical criticism